We're here with Paul and Daniel Brown to talk about their joint exhibition, Art That Makes Itself, at Watermans in West London. Could you just briefly explain how the show came about?
Danny and I have both been artists all of our lives and work fairly independently, but both work with computers and use a lot of the same methodology and technology and share that, though our work's very different. And then in 2009 we were both invited to exhibit at the Victoria and Albert Museum. There were two shows on. There was the big blockbuster show called Decode, which was downstairs, and Danny was commissioned to do a major piece for that, which is also here in the show today. And I was part of a show called Digital Pioneers, which was work from the permanent collection at the V&A, and that was held in about 3 or 4 of the upstairs back rooms. And a lot of people caught on to the fact that we were both exhibiting at the same time. A lot of people just didn't realise that we were related in any way. And so we got this idea that we could rebrand ourselves as Brown and Son and create that brand, not to particularly work together on joint projects, but simply to acknowledge that we were both artists working in the same medium, the same domain, and have an opportunity to show our work in that context. And so that was, we went ahead with that. We started a blog called Brown and Son, and then in 2003, I think it was, Sue Gollifer, who's at the University of Brighton, runs a very good program down there for new media arts, and also director of the ISEA, the International Symposium on Electronic Art Committee, invited us to show at the Brighton Digital Festival the next year under the banner of Brown and Son. And so that was the spark to get the exhibition together. And unfortunately that never happened. We couldn't raise enough funding to do that show. And so I got in touch with Irene. Irene's been running a very good program. This is Irene Papadimitriou here at Watermans, such a major international figures in the computers, art science and technology field. And she said, would you like a show at Watermans? And that was how it all came about.
Did you encourage Daniel to start up computer art, or do you think he looked at you and was inspired?
His mother and I were divorced when he was fairly young, and he used to come and stay with us, and he'd obviously see me working on big computers. And I mentioned we do have a book coming out in May, and he talks about this in the book. He's written one of the essays. And so clearly he was looking at the things I was doing, like the computer animation for a company called Digital Pictures I'd set up, and then working in academia setting up programs. But I think the major influence on him was through a friend of his mother's who had set up a multimedia company which was part of John Boys University in Liverpool. And that was Roy Stringer, quite a famous figure on the British multimedia scene. Sadly, he died about 10 years ago. And he invited Dan as a high school student to go in as a student intern. And so Dan, from quite a young age, he would have been 11 or 12, I guess, had access to all the latest whiz-bang technology and could go in whenever he liked. And they also got him to work on projects. So he was actually doing graphics for some very early Laserdisc interactives before CD-ROMs came along. So I think that certainly I would have influenced him, I hope so, but certainly in that part of his career, that Roy was a major influence on him.
And I really like the title of the show, Art That Makes Itself. How far do you think you are the maker, and how far do you think the computer is doing the making?
Very certainly I'm the maker. I think somewhere in the 60s, early 70s, I was attracted. I'd seen Cybernetic Serendipity, the show at the ICA. I knew that computers were the medium that I wanted to look at, to explore the ideas that I had. And I think back then, and if you look at the 60s, it was a time, sort of high modernism. A lot of artists were trying to remove any point of self-expression in their work. So there's people doing the flat field color painting where everything was very meticulously painted. there were artists beginning to use industrial techniques, so rather than make their own artworks, they'd send them out to factories who would make them for them. And these would be absolutely pristine, finished with no evidence of the human touch. So that was a very kind of popular aesthetic throughout the 60s and into the 70s. That would have influenced me. And I had this idea that if I could write in a symbolic code instructions like in Fortran or assembler, which was the languages I used in the early days, that I could distance myself from the work, so the work could have an identity of its own, quite separate from my identity. And so that was very much a starting point for me in works like this piece that I made in '75. However, by the middle of the 90s, I guess we'd all realised, the scientific community, that personality was very deeply ingrained. It was very hard to get rid of. You couldn't just separate yourself through a symbolic language. And also, whenever I exhibited, people would say, "Oh, it's just another Paul Brown." They'd caught on to the fact it was my work and so on. So the simple answer is, I think where we are now in history, these works are authored by me, but hopefully with a certain amount of independence. So a lot of the decisions that are made about what you actually see at any one time in a moving piece are made by a computer program, not me. So I'm still able, as the artist, to be quite surprised by one of my artworks. I can be watching it, like some of the works in this exhibition I've been looking at for 10 or 15 years, and they can still do things that surprise me. So there is a sense of spontaneity and serendipity inherent in the technology. And there are a group internationally of scholars, artists, musicians, critical thinkers who are looking at the possibility of computers gaining enough artificial intelligence that they can make completely independent autonomous artworks, but we're not there yet. But I do look forward to that time. I'd be very excited to see what kind of an artwork a true artificial intelligence might make.
And I wanted to ask about the specific programs that you use. You mentioned Fortran.
In the early days when I began to work, there were no graphic apps. Photoshop didn't exist, Adobe Illustrator didn't exist, none of that existed. And so it was necessary to write all of your own code from scratch. And so my early works, some of them are here in the show, I just wrote everything in Fortran and then in Assembler. Assembler is just faster to execute, much slower to write. And so now I do use a lot of ready-made apps, but in general, I'm still writing my own code. So when you look at one of my time-based pieces, they are coded in a language called Java, and I'm using a very easy-to-use development environment called Processing that was written by Casey Reese and Ben Fry, two young, contemporaries of Daniel's, friends of Daniel's, young artists in the States, and they've made processing available for free to anybody. It will run on any Linux, PCs, Macintosh, any computer, and it makes it relatively easy for you to write code to generate images and time-based sequences. And so I'm currently using processing as my development environment, but at the end of the day that produces Java code.
How far is your process collaborative?
It's not really. I've certainly been parts of groups, members of groups where other artists who program were there, and we'd share code. That certainly happened. And even today I'll share code with Dan. But largely speaking, I work fairly independently.
And how do you work? What's your process in your studio?
Yeah, my studio is basically a laptop computer, so it's an easy one to maintain. The start of a work is actually drawing. I draw a lot. And what I like to do is just make simple marks and see how they change and what possible processes can change them. And I'll come up with an idea, well, this might be interesting. And at that time, I might take it to the computer and just do some more rigorous drawings on the computer to give me an idea of what the geometric potential of the piece may be. And at some point, I'll think, okay, this is going to work. This is worth investing time in. And I'll then start to program the process together. And that can be quite a while before you actually see the results back. So anything from a few weeks to a few months, depending on the complexity of the problem and how committed I am to working on it. And at some point you see the output of that. Well, I see the output of that process, and it works or it doesn't work. And if it doesn't work, I tend to push it to one side and might pick it up years later and rework it. But if it is working, then I'll then try and put it together as a piece, as a final piece. And that process from making the drawing to actually having a final piece probably on average takes about 2 years. So I'm actually working on quite a lot of different pieces at the same time, and different ones are at different stages. Some are just starting, some are almost finished.
And how has your work developed as technology develops?
Resolution and speed. If you look at the time-based pieces that are here, the earliest one is the Builder-Eater, which is just here from 1977. And at the time it required a dedicated mini-computer, something that would cost about the same price as a house, to drive it. And it could just about drive it in real time. Nowadays, a program, I have that piece in the Digital Revolution show, which is touring after it finished at the Barbican, and it's running on a Raspberry Pi computer, which is about the size of a cigarette box, costs £20, and can do all of that stuff and more. So I think the answer is that what I've got over time is that the 1992 piece that's here, Infinite Variations version 1, I could just about make that on the laptop computers of the day. And in order to make it work, I had to actually pre-compile all the frames and just play the frames back. And so all the code did was play the frames. It didn't actually modify the geometry. All that had been pre-compiled into what we call sprites. Now, nowadays, I can do all of that in real time. I don't have to pre-compile any elements. I can directly generate each frame of these time-based pieces at high resolution. So these pieces, the big pieces, are in high definition. They're full HD images, and every pixel is being computed at 25 frames a second in real time. And so that's, and of course the color quality has got better. There's much better color fidelity now, big screens, 60-inch screens, very good quality projectors. And none of that existed when I started. So that I've seen quite a remarkable change in the speed of the computers, the size of the computers. They've got smaller and smaller, they've got faster and faster, and their ability to handle much higher resolution images with much better color fidelity.
You said when you first started making this kind of art, you were interested in modernism, and then you went to the Cybernetics Serendipity exhibition. But how has your kind of interest and influence on subject matter changed throughout this time that you've been making computer art?
It really hasn't. Downstairs there's a drawing that I did in 1967, just before I left Manchester College of Art. And if I look at that and I look at what I'm doing today, I can see that there's a straight line almost between the two, that what interested me then and what interests me now. It's really the same themes that I'm dealing with, but able to deal with them in much more sophisticated ways, and of course in a much more knowledgeable way, because I can return to an idea after 20 years. And I have a whole body of knowledge that I can apply to it, which I didn't have when I was a younger artist. But essentially the actual themes that I'm working with haven't changed. And one of the terms that I used to describe my work is the geometric sublime. And to just give you a bit of background to that, in 1990, an Australian artist, or a group of two artists, John McCormack and his colleague Alan, I've forgotten his name, proposed the idea of the computational sublime. And to give you an idea of what they meant by sublime, you can look at, say, pi. Pi is the ratio between the circumference of a circle and its diameter, and it's 3.145, and it goes on forever. It goes on to infinity. It never repeats itself. It's an irrational fraction. And if we mined pi, what we'd find, let's say we took each number and converted it to a color on the screen, and we filled in all the pixels on the screen, somewhere in pi we'd find a high fidelity photograph of the Queen. We'd find the whole of Gone with the Wind, the movie. We'd find a version of Gone with the Wind with Bart Simpson playing the lead role. It's all in there. Now, so this is the sublimity, if you like, of that infinite sequence of numbers. What, of course, we don't know is where to look. So yes, it's all in there. Tonight's winning lottery numbers are in there, but we have no idea where to look in this infinity of numbers. So taking that idea of the computational sublime, I thought, well, what I'm doing is really manipulating geometry. And so this idea of the geometric sublime, that I can actually build relatively simple processes that, because they can be recomputed continuously by the computer in real time, they tend to present even me as the artist with things that can surprise me. And so I'll look at something I think I just mentioned that I did several years ago, and I'll think, oh, I've never seen it do that before. And so this idea of this sublime nature of the processes is something that is very important to my work.
And I guess that's sort of combining the very rational subjects of maths and science and even engineering with something quite creative, which is art. And I guess that's an interesting juxtaposition. But how far do you find that you do rely on using maths and science and those types of things?
One way to answer that is to say that I generally read New Scientist, the weekly science magazine, and I have been since it came out in the 50s or the 60s. And I don't read art magazines. I find it much more interesting to read science and science magazines. My work doesn't use particularly, it involves maths, but it's not intrinsically about mathematics in that sense. It's much more to do with logic. I'm very interested in logic, and interestingly enough, you can actually build mathematics out of logic, which is what a computer does. So an adder in a computer which adds two numbers together is actually a set of logical gates or gates. And by switching those gates, you're able to add two numbers together. So mathematics is auspiced on logic, so logic is the substrate for that whole structure. So I'm quite obsessed by logic, and that's certainly very important to me. I've been an outsider in the art world more or less since I left my postgraduate studies at the Slade, and that was in '79. At that time, the art world was moving away from science. It was the Vietnam War period, it was CND, ban the bomb, and I think a lot of people in the what we now call the creative industries saw scientists as working with the military-industrial complex. They made bombs, computers were tools to make bombs with, and they became very unfashionable. And a group of us internationally began to set up opportunities to show our work. So the Leonardo magazine was one, set up by Frank Molina in '68. The Computer Art Society, which I currently am one of the committee members of, was established in '68. The International Symposium for Electronic Art, which I mentioned Sue Gollifer's involved with, was set up more recently. So these little artist-run initiatives started to happen internationally. We all knew about each other, so we could exhibit our work. But we were almost completely ignored by the art world, and really did have a sense of being outsiders, and I quite liked that. But then in the early 2000s, some of the pioneers were starting to die, and we became very concerned that their family didn't understand the value of their work, and in many cases it just got thrown on a skid and taken to the dump. And so the Arts and Humanities Research Board, as it was then, had just been set up, and we were able to get a grant for a project that was at Birkbeck College, University of London, to preserve the early days of the British computer arts. And so I worked on that for 3 years with Charlie Gear and Nick Lambert and Catherine Mason. And we then discovered that we weren't alone. There were other groups around the world who had exactly the same problem of making sure this work was preserved and recognised, because the thing that we found out in our researches was that if the art world doesn't take you up, you just don't get recognised, you get completely forgotten about. But what was interesting was that we identified two major collections. There was the Computer Art Society collection, which we had to hand, but also a friend of mine in America, Patrick Prince, had a private collection. And she was looking, they were downscaling, her husband had retired, they were downscaling from a big house to a small apartment, and she wanted to donate her collection. And through our connections at the Victoria and Albert Museum, I met Douglas Dodds, who's now the curator of computer art, and we were able to ensure that both of those collections were actually donated to the Victoria and Albert. Now, it was almost as if, I mean, just really, this is a crazy kind of, is it a simile or a metaphor, but you know, I'd spent the whole of my career pushing this snowball up the hill. And suddenly that breakthrough with the Victoria and Albert, it just started to roll down the hill on its own, getting bigger and bigger. And so from that that would have been about 2003, 4, 5, there's now a lot more interest in the art world, in the computer arts, and particularly in that historical period, which was really totally ignored at the time. And I think that's good for everybody, because we're getting a lot more recognition. We're getting invited to show in major exhibitions around the world.
And what do you think caused that momentum in 2003 for?
I guess it was an idea of its time. It wasn't just as in London, it wasn't just the Victorian Albert. About the same time, one of the big German collectors of computer art, himself an artist, a writer, a very famous writer of science fiction in German, never translated into English, Herbert Franke, wanted to get rid of his collection. It just became a burden. He had over 2,000 pieces. And I know that it went to Bremen, Kunsthalle Bremen, who now hold that collection. So these museums around the world were actually starting to collect the work. And of course what happens then is that the private galleries are saying, well, why aren't we taking interest in this? And so it just set the ball rolling and generated a new opportunity. And also, of course, that very early turn away from science in the arts that took place really probably in the 70s, to that decade of the 70s, had come full circle, and the arts as a whole were much more open to science and the ideas of science and art. So this was about the time that the Wellcome Foundation started to fund art projects, and of course they've gone on to do some amazing projects with art and science, particularly around medicine and biomedicine and stuff. Yeah.
And going back to the exhibition, I was quite interested to see that there's a lot of links to nature, and obviously Daniel's big flowers and the tree, we can see the butterflies behind. How do you think computers and nature sort of sit together, and has that been an inspiration for you as well?
It's been interesting because one of the things that reputations that I've earned is a pioneer of artificial life and art. And if you look at the period I was at the Slade, 77 to 79, the group of us, the artists working at the Slade, were all working with these ideas of cellular automata, of chaotic systems, fractals. They were getting popular at the time. And we started to work on them. They're taking these ideas to make artworks. And I was quite surprised. In 1999, I contacted Sussex University and began a long-standing relationship. I'm a visiting professor at Sussex still, 15 years I've been there now. And I introduced myself. This was at the time, one of the world's largest artificial life research centres, the Centre for Computational Neuroscience and Robotics at the University of Sussex. And I wrote to its co-director, Phil Husbands, and I started my email by saying, you won't know who I am, but I'm one of a group of artists that was playing around with these very early ideas of artificial life. And amazingly, in his reply, he said, yes, I do know who you are. And he actually knew about this group at the Slade who were developing these ideas. And it wasn't for another 10 years that science really picked them up, and the science of artificial life started to develop as a scientific discipline. And so I think it's one very good example of art influencing science, where artists take an idea, run with it, and that has so much value that then the scientists adopt it and it becomes part of their profession, it becomes a scientific discipline. So I think that's quite an interesting history of this area of artificial life, which is a very important area now of how you can use computational processes to make living processes, and a lot of work's being done with that in a lot of different application areas. And it's almost as important if you think of the weaving. I mean, weaving goes right back into prehistory. We have no idea when it started. And yet it was Jacquard's punch cards with his automated loom, which he invented about 1780, I think, which really then fed into Babbage's experiments with analog technology in the middle of the 19th century, 1850, 1860, and directly led to IBM. IBM's first name was the Hollerith Punch Card Company. And so they'd taken these ideas that a weaver had developed 200 years before and thought, we can make machines to analyze statistical information like the census by using punch cards. And that's the foundation of the company we know today as IBM.